So this week we are very lucky to have Camilo Gómez-Rivas here from the University of Santa Cruz, California, Santa Cruz. He is associate professor in the Department of Literature there. Technically his title is Associate Professor of Mediterranean Studies, which is a cool title. He was at the American University in Cairo between 2009 and 14 as assistant professor of Middle Eastern history, and came to Santa Cruz from there. He's also been a visiting professor, research professor at the Philipps University in Marburg, Germany for the last 2 years. His first book is on the spread of Maliki law, called Law and the Islamization of Morocco under the Almoravids. Did I get that right? Yes. And in 2015. And he's also working on a short book, sort of a very short history of the Almoravid period in the Maghrib. So look for that coming soon, as well as this new project that he's working on refugees and displacement in the Maghrib, and sort of the making of the Maghrib as a space of memory and displacement, remembering homelands and things like that. So today he's really following up with the talk last week and fitting into our project, as well as introducing, in a way, next week's project or next week's talk, in thinking about the movement of legal ideas across the Islamic world. And in particular, as I said in the first meeting, the goal of this series is to sort of ping pong between modern issues and historical frameworks, partly in an effort to get a sense of how we treat historical accounts of movement and displacement and migration or expulsion or whatever differently, with different terms, almost, I would say, over-moralizing in a certain perspective, whereas we talk about present-day conflicts in a completely different light. So I'm trying to juxtapose these two rhetorics with this talk series to get an idea of how we might think about stories of movement or historical accounts of movement and migration, transmission, spread of culture, whatever, in different terms than the way our sort of standard histories sum up the spread of culture. So as part of that, we have Camilo today, who's going to talk about this sort of cool idea of Islamic law in motion through different characters, saints, merchants, and technocrats. And I think partly, that's how I want to think about all of the stories of movement across this series, are through individual eyes, right? Not to think of it as generic historical narratives, but to think through case studies and how that's something we can do on a present day sort of current events discussion, whereas we lose this often when we talk about these grand historical narratives that seem to tend towards the present. So I think this will be really useful to open up this alternative discussion. And with that, I'll leave it to Camilo. Thanks, Camilo. Welcome. Thank you.
So I'm gonna go. Here. Good afternoon. Thank you, Ryan, for the introduction. Thank you for having me and hosting me. This is an exciting opportunity to talk to you, to talk about these ideas. It's the exact nature of the talk. I'm thinking of this kind of as a class and introducing a set of ideas, and I'll put it this way. I don't want you to think of me as an expert in Islamic law, among other things, because I think I'm a little bit suspicious of expertise in law. I think it creates its own kind of authority, and that's not what I'm trying to pose as here. Rather, I think that knowledge of Islamic law is really valuable to gain, and then certainly having that kind of expertise helps us to read a lot of things, but that some of these texts, including legal texts, can be read differently, and you can ask all kinds of questions from them, and I'm kind of here to tell you why that's interesting, and that's kind of the perspective that I want to bring. And I'm trying to, and I start with some pretty broader notions of the topic of this class and series about movement. because I have been thinking about movement a lot in the last 10 years, and a lot kind of recently, in the last 2 years, in how we interpret it and understand it. So this was my working title. Sorry if it doesn't exactly match the thing. So the first broad idea is this culture and movement and how they're related, and these are two kind of problems that I see with they both sentences with but, two problems that I see in our notions of culture, and they're really recurrent and they're kind of basic. But the first one is just this persistent notion that the origins of culture are fixed. And that goes so much as even in our present day notion of what America is. I find there's this like regenerative, ongoing idea that imagines a past that is fixed, pristine, from a place. So not just in the medieval past. Certainly our notions of medieval culture have this, that we have this idea that Germanness comes from some particular place, and that is the origins of culture as we know it. That this is a really persistent notion. So, and I want to argue the contrary, that in fact our cultures, our linguistic ones, our cultures of representation, our literary ones, are the products of movement. So including our religions, certainly Christianity and Islam and Judaism, but others as well, and our ways of knowing, like math is the obvious one. Our use of math is a product of movement and interaction. It doesn't come from a place. Thought A, thought B, that we also privilege European movement in our understanding of historical change and its relationship to movement. So much so that this kind of idea of European movement defines modernity and our vision of the world and world history. A lot of it's, even though we don't say it that way, it's kind of like a given, in the formation of a lot of academic departments, for example. But European movement is kind of like the motor of world history and of creating new forms, and a lot of critical theory is about that. And it's very interesting, but it leaves us, when we're thinking about pre-modernity, often with poor tools. And I want to argue too tell you, or us to think, that cultural forms before modernity are also the product of movement. They don't come from a place, they're not stable before that. These, I think, are the two kind of basic questions that I find myself asking over and over when thinking about, culture, movement, culture, and history. What is the agency of movement, of flows, of people, of things, and of ideas? And realizing, of course, that those three things never occur separately, even though we tend to tell their history separately. But but that question of how does this movement and of this quantity affect the place that it's going to and the place it's going through? And how is movement construed, and why is it so variably interpreted? And I think this will come up again, but simply that question of why is somebody's adventure another person's displacement, and how we think of that historically, and how we can, and it makes us ask questions about the narratives of displacement, especially historical ones, maybe with a critical eye. I'm also kind of aware that I'm your first and one of two kind of medievalists or pre-modernists, and that a lot of you may not be pre-modernist or work on the pre-modern world, so some of these ideas are about that. This kind of broad notion, Islam and movement, I think Islam is a major globalization movement before modernity, or it's a good way of thinking about it. I think that Islamic law, broadly conceived, offers a critical lens for understanding the multifaceted character of Islam and movement. If only for one, because of its richness as a textual resource. There's a lot of texts, documentary, literary, archival, that on a very big scale that we can read and get a lot from. As well, of course, because of the positioning of this kind of its relationship to culture and to administration, because it often straddles very interesting questions between commerce and political legitimacy and literary narrative, which I think can be exploited or read. But of course, to always remember that Islam is not monolithic. It is completely like what do you want to call it? It's a fiction that it's one thing. It is many things. It's not monolithic. It's always multiple and contested. It's better to think of Islams and Islamic societies and Islamicate societies, which is part of, it's in the title of your series too, this notion of the Islamicate. So I think I'll bring up again. This is like a kind of map you can find online. Useful, and I wanted to bring it up for two reasons. Well, one is obvious. It's called The Spread of Islam, 622 to 750. For the and I have a couple points right after this, but well, the size of this, that it is a kind of something happening that is affecting the world, and for you to remember, these are the earliest expansion. Sorry, I'll figure that out later. Later expansion and latest expansion, but all between 622 and 750. That's one, just a memory of that. I'm going to be talking about this region in a second. That's where I'm kind of focused on. But this topic, of course, is important to the entire Islamic and Islamicate world. These questions that you can read through Islamic law and Islamic law at the frontiers and Islamic law and movement. And then I would to point out a couple of problems and of questions that we should ask this, interrogate this map, and why it's wrong or distorting too, is because this is not really about the spread of Islam. I would argue that Islam was not a fully articulated discursive system or recognizable form, or that it had recognizable relationships to its non-adherents in the year 750. So it's not like Islam spread and by 750 it was there. It wasn't. And another major point, of course, is that there's this continued diffusion after this, which is what we're asking about. And it's not the nature of that later diffusion is not the nature of military conquest. So these are the points. So in the year 750, which is extremely early in 750, there are no canonical hadith collections. The language is not in widespread use, Arabic, etc. But the major military conquest happened before this. So these are these points. So that after 732, military conquest is no longer a driving force of expansion. That in this year 750, Islam is not institutionalized in a recognizable way. So what we come to know as classical Arabic literature or classical Islamic law aren't really formed by 750 yet, doctrinally, legally, and textually. That, of course, in this period in 750, Islam is a minority religion in most of its territory. This is really interesting when you think, for example, about the historiography of the conquests, which are kind of heroic narratives about noble Arab warriors expanding the religion in the frontiers. And the narratives are about these specific characters performing both heroic and righteous acts. And the genre has a peculiar ability to ignore the non-Muslim majority of the population. And we can forget that super easily. That in Egypt this great majority of Christians are there, but they can be kind of effaced by these narratives. and that, of course, in our after expansion in like 1300, which I'm going to show you in a second, that's changed in places, and that has changed several what we can think of as Islamic institutions. There's this another. I think it's important to remember that that this first, this expansion of the early caliphate, if you want to call it that, and then 750, which is very early, that it starts to break down and fragment politically very early. So political fragmentation begins from 750s, and it becomes decisive by the year 900. So this is a fragmented space, which means that central power is not a main driving force for diffusion, for institutionalization. And that it's polycentric. There's this polycentric dynamic. Yeah. as a kind of way of thinking about Islam in 1300, there was this map on the travels of Ibn Battuta, famous Moroccan traveler from 13. What year did he? I think it's written around the 1340s. And I don't know. This is actually comparing three famous travelers. One point to be made. I mean, there's this well-known point about a thing about Ibn Battuta's travelers is that he works as a Maliki. His expertise in Maliki jurisprudence is recognized throughout his travels, and he works for big parts of his journeys. He's not just adventuring; he's actually living places and working. So that in his movement through this global medieval space, most of it is through Islamic and Islamicate places, or places where he could interact with institutions that he would recognize and in which his knowledge and expertise were recognized. Does that make full sense? That's a big difference between him and Marco Polo. But one should say also that Marco Polo's, most of his travel is also through this Islamic and Islamicate world. And he had to learn how to use it as well, which I think is important. The other part, of course, is that this shows, between 750 and 1300, there's a great continued diffusion of Islamicate culture, Arabic textual forms and stuff, including into what today are the most populous regions of the Muslim world, like Nigeria, like India, later Indonesia. So this is useful and of course here we have Timbuktu, which I'm going to bring up and is going to come up in your next talk. So one of the questions is if there's no military expansion, of course, why and how is there a kind of diffusion of the religion and of its legal practices into a place like Timbuktu? And what can we read into it, and how do we think about it? Another set of points. So we're thinking more specifically about law and Islamic law, and why study it, is because I believe these are true. In the medieval world, so in both in the Mediterranean, in Europe, and in the Middle East, law is one of the chief forms of advanced literacy and literate culture. So it's important in the amount of text that it's produced. I think about Chaucer, and Chaucer would have been very comfortable with his legal culture. And also to point out that a lot of the people that we see moving, a lot of the literate people we see moving in the medieval Mediterranean are people who have legal expertise. And one of the questions is why? And one of the answers is because it's a powerful tool that was capable of spilling over political borders and to become adopted for its obvious practical and political potential. So that it's in the history of the expansion of Islam, Islamic law and literacy, Arabic literacy, if we're thinking about the West, is recognized for obvious practical and political potential, including in a place like Timbuktu and West Africa. Does that make sense? Yeah. And it's powerful too. So, but it's also, and this is the thing when talking about it, it's not just law. It's its connection with widely held values, religious and cultural values, that makes it also very powerful, I think. So it is powerful too because it is identified with faith, with justice, civilization, order, and an idea of the good society. So it's not just a technical expertise, it's also deeply identified with ideas of justice and something I guess I would call a good society, something to aspire to. And this, I think, also gets forgotten and not discussed, and I've been trying to incorporate it in teaching recently, is that it's also interconnected with literature and dominant in forms of cultural representation and narrative. and that this is also one of its powers. I'll give you a reading on the four madhabs. I didn't have time to reread it, but I thought it would be useful that if you get a chance to read it, to not go into a full explanation of what these are. So this is kind of how I've tried to summarize thinking about that, because I'm talking about in the title of the talk, and one of the reasons I'm presenting this way and a way I'm thinking about it, because I've been commissioned to write two kind of histories of the Malikis in Africa. One is in Africa, and the other one's more broadly. And something else may come out of this. So how do we think of the history of one of these madhabs, the Maliki one? These madhabs are, Sunni Islam came to identify itself with four schools that coalesced from the 9th and 10th centuries. These four schools that you read about are Hanafi, Maliki, Shafi, and Hanbali, right? They are identified with teacher-student networks. So the shape of these schools or these movements are networks or generations of students and teachers, and that's how they would. One of the most important parts of how they self-identify, I learned from so and so, or on the authority of so and so. Around these eponymous founders, so each of those names corresponds to a founder, grand ancestor kind of thing, who did not necessarily think of themselves as founding something, but then later by the students were made into that founding authority. I think I forgot exactly how Halak puts it in that section that I told you to read about, but he also emphasizes that one of the things about that consolidation is that it is a kind of consolidation or becoming concrete of a set of interpretive practices. That what defines Malikis versus Shafis versus Hanbalis is like an interpretive commitment to a certain approach or set of approaches to legal problems. That's his idea. There's a lot of ink spilt and literature about what exactly makes a madhab when they actually come into form. And another thing about them is that they have kind of they're predominant in specific regions. The Maliki law or school is the major school of law in what was Islamic Spain, in North Africa, and in West Africa, and which is why my focus is on that side, and why I looked into Maliki texts to begin with. So regionally established, often with key episodes of adoption by important state-building movements. I was just thinking about this. And because when I'm thinking about this, I personally am not just trying to think about Malikis. Like my personal question is not so much about who the Malikis are. I'm more interested broadly in Islamic law and how it moves through the Sahara, for example. And when we should remember that it's not all Malikis, even though it becomes the dominant tradition. I think that the fact that Malikis are dominant in Spain and North Africa, and that Hanafis were in Turkey, one could say, without much of a doubt, that it's because of a combination, because of an adoption or association with an important state-building moment, with like the Ottomans, with the Spanish Umayyads. So the Malikism was the official school of Umayyad Spain. Medieval. And I think those are key for them becoming regionally dominant. But it's not. To contradict that too is that there are other moments, important moments, when the school survives as an intellectual tradition, and a legal tradition, outside of state sponsorship, even against the state, which is also hugely interesting and important. So we kind of have a back and forth. Something that's certainly worth thinking about. I don't want to give you a history of Malikism, but these were like the kind of notes about how I think about how I would structure it. And as I said, in a way, I'm trying to think about how to structure it, what's most important in the history, in this history of this madhab. and to clarify for you, so there's this founder, Malik ibn Anas of Medina, died in the year 796. There's a book that he's associated with, which is called Al-Muwatta. And one can think of it, it's one of the earliest extant legal works, on the one hand. It's also one of the earliest extant hadith collections. So it's early for those two things. A defining thing about Malikism, because you will, maybe, I don't know if you've read descriptions about comparing schools, claiming that one is more conservative than the other. There's one kind of popular, I don't know, maybe, or more maybe colonial and modern descriptions of them that try to characterize them as conservative or tolerant. And I find that like extremely unhelpful to a long-term reading of it. I don't find them easily characterizable as rigid or tolerant, or that hasn't really helped me. What I would say one key, and this is actually self-identifying, I think, by some of the scholars in Malikism, this concept of the amal of Ahl al-Medina, which is the practice of the people of Medina, is a really kind of important idea in Malikism, which is amal has multiple meanings, but it kind of means legal practice, technically, or like the practice. So there's this concept because Malik is from a near companion or new companions of the Prophet. So he was a direct witness to people who had lived with the Prophet in his city, so in his first political community of belief, is I think what I call it there. That is the kind of anchor of authority. You know, we don't need exactly to tell you that one transmitter of some hadith a million miles away came and told us that the Prophet said X. We also, kind of recorded what happened in his city. And therefore, and this is the practice there. And so that's kind of like a key thing for that, I would say, defines Malikism. This would be kind of schematic, like transmission of it. Medina to Kairouan, which is in, where's Kairouan? Do you all know? Tunisia. In Tunisia. And it was a really important city. It was like a really important sort of medieval city in Tunisia, and really important for this school, intellectually, for transmission to the West. Cordoba, and then Marrakesh. So there's this movement. It goes from kind of Tunisia to Spain, then to Morocco, which is a particularity about the history of the West. Morocco was a little bit of a frontier zone, and we're going to talk about Morocco in a second, or right now. But there's that move: Kairouan, Cordoba, Marrakesh, Timbuktu. You can think of it that way, and I think that is certainly a way of tracing it, and that's what we're tracing here. But I also want to, with the caveat, too, that this movement is never linear, and especially, let's say, in Islam. And there's like one thing that, because we see, if anything, there's like one mechanism in the Islamic world that interrupts this movement and the pilgrimage, like the Hajj, which is not always done by lots of people, but when I was just like going over some of these scholars, there's a kind of radial. So there is this kind of movement following this direction, but then there's also people moving back to one of our major scholars later writes from Medina, so he kind of goes back to the origin and interacts with scholars in Timbuktu. So there's this kind of linear movement, as well as a continued movement to, I don't want to call it a center, but you can call it a spiritual center. But with a continued or cycles of intellectual production that are important in places like Medina, certainly places like in Cairo. So while this linear movement is important for the Maliki school, and while the Malikism in Cairo is not a major force, historically we find Maliki scholars residing in Cairo being really important scholars for the movement. And these are like four kinds of major scholars of Malikism, and I just try to put like four because they're kind of different types. you find somebody like Yahya ibn Yahya al-Laythi, who is kind of like credited with bringing the Malik's text, the Muwatta, to Spain. So he's often cited as that, like the kind of founder, the person who brought the knowledge or that text from the center. And then you have these two kinds of, I find Sahnun extremely important, but Ibn Abi Zayd as well. They wrote commentaries. So the shape of these schools, especially Malikism, which is the one I know best, they form around a series of problems, or areas of life. You could think of marriage and ritual prayer, but then dealt as a series of questions. What if and what happens when? And then a series of answers. So those are often, that structure reminds one of hadith, right? Of the prophetic sunnah, which also a lot of it seems to be dominated by a kind of question and answer form. So a lot of what the legal writings have that same kind of format: questions and answers and reasons for that answer. Some of them are big compilation books dealing with previous questions and new commentary on that, and they wrote, I'm going to show you another kind of a category of this, but they wrote, maybe Sahnun wrote probably what was the most important of those collections in the West. It's called the Mudawwana al-Kubra. And I would start there if I were like investigating Malikism in the West. And then I'm going to include Ibn Rushd al-Jad here. He's somebody I've worked on, and to make a point. He's one of the most important Islamic legal scholars of Al-Andalus, of Islamic Spain. He's also the grandfather of Averroes, his very, very, very famous grandson. And his most important work maybe is Al-Bayan wa Tahsil and his Fatawa. And what I would call him, so he wrote something similar. He's had commentaries and dealing with questions. But one thing we've come to call him is something called like neo-Malikism. Some people refer to it as a kind of reformed Malikism. And what it is a 12th century Malikism that has incorporated a more sophisticated theoretical toolbox in what has become a more sophisticated legal discourse. And from other schools. So one simple way of thinking about it is like Islamic legal theory from Shafi'ism, or from the school of the Shafi'is, incorporated the techniques into Malikism. So it's kind of a theoretically more sophisticated Malikism emerges out of his writing. And that's one way of looking at it. And kind of repeating a little bit what I had said, this is a kind of way of thinking of the texts that are produced by these scholars. And one way you can see this transmission flowing. So there's these biographical dictionaries. I don't know if you've worked with them or heard of them or looked at them. They're kind of boring and they're hard to read through, but they're useful. They show us these really useful things. I think of them as this kind of history and intellectual genealogy of the institution. They really show us the shape of the institution, of the legal scholarly network, and how they think where they came from. There's what we said, this sort of commentary on questions and opinions and new answers, which I'm thinking of as the main form for substantive elaboration of the law. The kind of like these famous set of questions. These famous set of answers, and I'm writing more commentary on why this answer is so good, or maybe why something was left out. Super interesting thing about this kind of genre and this genre is that there's a kind of accordion effect, and you can actually, summary. So Malik's Muwatta is a pretty short text. It's like a series of, kind of imagine it as famous questions and famous answers, and then the Sahnun's Mudawwana is like 5-8 times longer, kind of writing commentary about that. Ibn Rushd wrote on a similar text, an expanded commentary of that, which like made it much bigger. And then you kind of have the appearance of summaries that shrink it back to make it more manageable. Like these are the most important parts of this 13-volume collection. And then you have commentaries on those summaries. So, and this is kind of important for thinking about medieval literature in general, this kind of accordion effect. It's a living tradition this way. It's like the act of copying and distributing is not just mechanical copying, it's reading and commentating and summarizing and commentating and summarizing and commenting. And these are similar, and I'll let that at that. There's this other genre, which I'm going to show you. I'm going to just one example in a second, which is called the notarial formulary, and it's important sort of as a kind of documentary source. And it's, it's like models for writing contracts. It's also extremely boring. But we have a bunch of medieval ones and they can be read to. You can ask it really interesting questions because it has a series of these are like the regular contracts that a notarial person working would need to know how to draw up a marriage contract, how to draw up a sales contract, et cetera, et cetera. So I've said let me think of this. Yeah, I want to talk about these 3 points. And I'll move a little bit faster because I've said a lot of what I wanted to say here. Like, why does law move? It's a powerful tool. It can be cultivated outside of state sponsorship. It can be used in state building and legitimation. It offers a means for negotiating conflict that is predictable and regular. And it can cross cultural difference with so it offers this intelligibility and predictability. I can come back to these, but they're also kind of repeated at the end. I think this kind of, the fact that this law can be transmitted into spaces that are not under the patronage of a centralized state means, in my opinion, that there's a kind of flexibility and resilience to this system, to the discursive system. And this I kind of thought of as a schematic, as a kind of cycle, that it can be seen as a commercial tool, which is part of the spiritual community, which can be used for political legitimation and repeat. And here's very specifically thinking about southern Morocco and West Africa. I wanted to offer, so like as an illustration of those points, I was thinking of 3 kind of characters that illustrate, what we've been talking about. I'm going to jump to it. This is just, I don't know, to have a visual of the kind of, the Dra Valley, the kind of architecture and region that I'm thinking about in southern Morocco. And because right south of this, there's a place called Tamagrut, which is it's a library. It's a kind of a famous, it's not Timbuktu, but it's much smaller scale, but it's kind of a desert library. And it's kind of from visiting it that it made me personally ask those questions of why would you build a library, or how does a library get built in a place that doesn't have like a strong state patronage? And or why like a legal collection in a state that doesn't, in a place that doesn't have, I don't know, the police or imperial, the resources of a larger state. Why cultivate this thing that doesn't necessarily, how is it policed then, or what's its use? Why isn't it just Qurans in a way? But one of the questions. So I was thinking of like moment 1 for me is this person, Abdallah ibn Yasin. So I'm moving here to a specific moment in time, the 11th century in southern Morocco and the Western Sahara. I offer this map because this is an important thing that's happening that's going to lead to this person's life. So Abdallah ibn Yasin, he's Al-Ghazuli. He's known as the founder of the Almoravids. Yeah, that would be the one thing to remember. Founder of the Almoravids. And the Almoravids are the first indigenous large-scale Muslim state-building movement in Morocco. And that's why they're important in one way of saying it. But he comes from way south. He comes from the Sahara. In a way, yeah. I wanted to point to two things. Well, one thing that's interesting in his life is that one of the narratives about his life connects him to Kairouan Malikis. So he's eventually identified as a Maliki. Yeah. But from reading the different versions of his life, you see him, and modern ones in a way, you see he's kind of construed differently. He's kind of seen. If you go there, there's a shrine, there's a Marabout, or I don't know if it's a Zawiya or it's not a Ribat. There's his grave is a kind of a place of visitation, and he's known regionally as Sidi Abdallah, and you could kind of confuse him with a saint. So he's kind of in a way part of a not saintly tradition, but of a local spiritual tradition on the one hand. He becomes kind of canonized. That's not the right word, but the other there's these two important early sources on his life. One's Al-Bakri, he's a person from Al-Andalus, and the other person is Qadi Iyad, who I'm going to talk about more. In Al-Bakri, this one version, he's described as kind of like I always use rustic, backwoods, eccentric, religious person. Yeah, you kind of get the picture. And Bakri shows Bakri is an Andalusi. He kind of sees himself as more sophisticated than him. Kind of explains him as like, oh yeah, there's this religious movement down here, but they kind of make mistakes, and so kind of like as an illustration of like piety, but without like enough knowledge. That's how I would characterize Bakri. And it was a very important textual tradition later. It gets repeated by several people. In Qadi Iyad, a little bit less so, maybe outside, but it's more important in the Maliki tradition. And his version is kind of completely different. And it's this one. And this is like I highlighted these two that we could just focus on. He commanded them and they executed the penalties he imposed upon their Amir. They memorized his legal rulings, his fatwa, and his answers. So he out of this he kind of emerges as an ideal leader, ideal spiritual leader, and also as a founding member of the Malikism in the Maghrib. So he's incorporated into a biographical dictionary this way, and also there's kind of a theory of rule, of just rule, implied in this characterization of the role of law and in the role of the legal scholar and the legal scholar's relationship to military power or to secular power, and so a very different character emerges here. Now, the one key thing, there's a lot to say here, but one key thing is that Qadi Iyad wrote the first biographical dictionary of Malikism in the Far West, and he wrote this entry on Abdallah ibn Yasin. So this biographical dictionary is very important in the history of Malikism in the West. It's like kind of foundational that way, and this founder has been drawn this way, and kind of thinking about like this is the role, kind of the ideal role of the school of law in this region and its relationship to political rulers. Okay, this is the second person is the person who wrote this text. So he's happening a little bit later, a century later, a little bit before that. He's kind of a product of this Almoravid patronage of the Malikis. There's this not collusion or association, but they're mutually dependent, these two groups. He's from the north. He's from Sabta. He's an exponent of Almoravid patronage of the network. He becomes a champion defender of the Almoravids. He actually falls trying to defend the city from the Almohad takeover. But I wanted to point to these two things I already mentioned. One, he wrote this first Tarjama collection, or the first biographical dictionary. So it's important obviously historiographically because you can read it and study it, but it also it's a moment in which you see a institution or a network crystallize in a place, and you can kind of see it in this writing of this. And then, of course, how he historicizes, or he brings in Ibn Yasin into the narrative. But he also, and he was an important legal correspondent in the book I wrote. He emerges as this, he wrote to the muftis, to the legal jurisconsults or authorities of Al-Andalus for opinions which he implemented in where he worked in northern Morocco. And he wrote this book called Ash-Shifa. He's very, very famous for this book. And I would just want to mention, I don't know if any of you have heard of that book, Ash-Shifa. It's about Prophet Muhammad. It's a famous for way beyond Malikism, way beyond the region. It's a very well-known book. I think it's a way of this new Maliki group in Morocco, what do you want to call that? Adopting or taking to itself the kind of the religious charisma of the Prophet in a way. It's a form of institutionalizing charisma and of claiming religious and spiritual place for the new Maliki ulama and its role in the Maghrib. And this was my third character on this line, and I'm not going to talk a lot about him. He will come up because Timbuktu, one of the major scholars who were active in this kind of famous legendary Timbuktu that produced the manuscript collections, one would think of Ahmed Baba as possibly the main figure. He is a 17th century figure, but we can kind of connect him to what we've been talking about. In one obvious way is this: he's one of the things he's a specialist in, other than law and jurisprudence, is as a Maliki biographer. So he wrote his own tarjama collection. I've used these two words, tarjama and tabaqa. I wrote tabaqa. I've said tarjama. Two words for biographical collections, lives collections. He wrote one that introduces 14 West African scholars, but it uses a lot of the material from Qadi Iyad. So there's a very clear connection between the two, as well as from this Ibn Farhun, who's the one who wrote from Medina. So just if you were going to go and look for Maliki biographical collections, I would start with those three: Iyad, Farhun, and Ahmed Baba. And then looking at how he describes these 14 Western African scholars in Timbuktu, answers a series of questions of how the Maliki position in Timbuktu was, and how the legal authority and spiritual authority was conceived of by him there. Do I have like 5 minutes? Or okay. Have I completely? Normally, I would, if we were in class, I would certainly stop for a break right now, but we'll push on for about 5 minutes to the kind of conclusion. I have two documents, two kind of examples, and then a set of conclusions. What kind of other? So we have the biographical dictionaries is one thing to look at, but there are other genres or documents or writings that we could look at. This is one, Hawala and Suftaja. Which one could say, it's a bill of exchange, this hawala. They're kind of synonymous. They're widespread in the Islamic world. They're a form of debt transfer. Yeah, it's like you owe me, but I owe you something, but somebody owes me, so we can transfer the debt. In order to pay you, I'm going to transfer that debt to you. Yeah. It turns out that this kind of legal commercial tool, was key in trans-Saharan commerce. And we have, for the medieval period, what I've put here is an example. This is an example this is an 18th century copy of a formulary, one of those, what's a formulary? Handbook for how to write contracts. This is one of those examples, and it's composed in the 13th century, 12th, 13th century. And you have a series of this. So this practice of debt transfer, one could say it's one of the foundations for the appearance of the legal network in the Sahara, writing up this kind of commercial transfer, commercial exchange. And you see it from the Geniza to the 19th century. So from the 12th century to the 19th century. And today. So actually, if you Google it today, it comes up in a lot of this discussion about terrorism funding, because that's one terrorism, quote unquote. That's one popular recent discourse about it, because it became associated with the suspicious contemporary funding practices or money transfer practices, and there's also a big debate in Islamic finance. So through this avoidance of riba or usury, and there's these practices that are seen. So through one set of studies, they're seen to be some of the devices that are used to circumvent riba prohibitions or usury prohibitions, which I won't go into. But I'm more interested in how it's also this is clearly like a widespread practice in the Sahara, and I think is one of the sort of practical foundations for what we've been talking about. Transfer debt or endorsement when someone has a debt, but okay. The other one, and another kind of practice. There are several of these forms of debt transfer in commercial. This is just one example of a commercial tool. Another and the fatwa is a kind of what do you want to call it? The literary source or textual source that I've used. It's like questions that are asked, that are asking for a legal opinion, which we've mentioned. But these are kind of ongoing, they're produced in an ongoing manner. And they are brought into collections that then can be used as reference. And the Maliki school has this wonderful particularity about it, that it has rich collections of these fatawa that include a lot of historical detail. So they're not completely abstracted. They often include some of the circumstances of what produced the question. I read, so I used, these are two of the ones that I looked at. They're from like the 12th century Marrakesh, right, as it's founded, and these questions are being sent to a mufti in Cordoba asking these things like, how do you settle dispute over an amount paid when one person is paid, the other one claims that it wasn't paid in full or that was paid with the wrong currency? How do we settle that? And the other question was like, similar. There's been this exchange. One of the parties that says that there was a lack in the exchange. What is our method for solving that exchange? And there are, from the Western Maghrib and through these generations, you see several of these questions being produced. We can ask a legal historical question about it, like what's the actual legal problem that they're talking about, but I also think it's important to see the kind of social, economic, or social historical process that it's taking part in trans-Saharan commerce. I should say that a thing about the Almoravids to Ahmed Baba, so this kind of 12th century to the 17th century, I also didn't mention that another reason Ahmed Baba is very famous is because this Moroccan sultan infamously led this military occupation of Timbuktu, kidnapped Ahmed Baba, took him back to Marrakesh, and he wrote some of his stuff in Marrakesh. There's this kind of, I don't know, trying to take it back or to take this scholarly family as it's an imperial move by Morocco in this key early modern moment to try to be a world player. But between this 12th century and the 17th century, this is the heyday of trans-Saharan commerce in trans-Saharan commerce in general and in the Western Sahara specifically. It's on a much greater, it existed before, it existed afterwards, but on a much smaller scale. Or in the post-colonial, it's a kind of a different problem. Pre-Islamic times, There is trans-Saharan commerce, but not nearly as robust. And with the Almoravids, it's really kind of a revolution, a commercial revolution. And that is one of the things that's producing these documents. A, the commercial tools, and B, ongoing resolution of, these are simple commercial disputes. The law here and the legal expertise is being offered to resolve these commercial disputes. And I'm positing these as like practical dimensions to the development of this thing. And I think these were like the last ideas, concluding remarks, and then 3 titles that I will share with you. Any refining of these would be super helpful for me. Yeah.
Oh, do you mind if I ask a question?
Sure, please.
So when I was going through the reading, just looking through this presentation, I can't help but think as though that we view the legitimacy of the law as only discourse between the intelligentsia or like the literate people and whatnot. And I guess my question was, how high was literacy in the Islamicate or in the Islamic world, especially in the Maghrib at that time?
Yeah.
And were there other mechanisms through which the law was legitimized so that people, like the common man, would be like, okay, yeah, we'll follow the law? Because I was thinking, when you mentioned the Hawala, that might have been a legitimizing mechanism because it was a way of upholding trade, but were there any other ways that, like, I guess certain schools of thought of law appealed to the non-literate masses?
So the short answer to the literacy is very limited. And so what we have is and I think it also, it's important for us to understand like the origins of this literate network so before Malikism, there's these embodied network of like Muslim scholars from the 9th century in the Sahara. I think the people who are literate are very, very few. So it's certainly an elite. I think that kind of, because that it's a small elite, it explains the formation of networks of even what do you want to call them? Widespread or far apart networks of literacy. That's one answer. So it's very small compared to the modern world, to the post-19th century. And that means that the social interaction and dynamic is different. On the other hand, we pointed to that one of the powers of Islamic law, and one of the things that's often said, is that common people, non-literate people, have a deep knowledge of the law and how it affects, and because it deals with individual behavior, intimate behavior, and belief and faith. So there is an institutionalized form of interaction involves. It becomes an obligation, to consult an authority when you have a moral question, and on the kind of moral side, there certainly is like a lot of interaction between the literate and illiterate. So does that answer a little bit your question?
I think so. The cultural normalization of certain schools of law basically, propagated the continual following of certain schools of thought or methods.
Can you say that again?
Basically, the existence of the law was kind of turned into a norm, even among the masses, and that in turn served as a mechanism of legitimization for certain madhabs in a given area.
Yeah, it's hard to posit the question generally, because it's a really evolving. It really depends where you're asking it from, and it's a changing context. Something like the Hawala too, because I think in the trans-Saharan space is complicated because it's not within a state. It's not or a kingdom or a polity or a sultanate or a it's kind of, which that's why I think it's particularly interesting because it raises several questions. I tend to use legitimation as as something that a ruler is trying to get for himself, right?
Okay.
So it's a way of especially like say the Sultan, which we could say that the Sultan is a kind of Muslim secular ruler who appears around the 11th century, the Almoravid Sultan being one of those, the Almoravid Emir, and that they are legitimizing themselves through being patrons of these ulama who themselves, by writing like, are the guardians of the faith. Yeah, and I think something like Ayyad's Shifa shows him both as he's like a judge, he has technical expertise, but he also writes this book on piety and the figure of the Prophet. So it's also very much like a religious text and a religious practice text. And I think one of the things he's doing is that he's saying that the Maliki ulama in the Maghrib under the Almoravids are both the guardians of justice and of knowledge of religion and sources for knowledge of the faith.
Okay.
And so they're resources for the people to go to ask to learn about the faith, and that they are able to work because they are patronized by the state, this, or I don't know what you want to call it, kingdom, sultanate.
Right.
So I normally use legitimation as a referring to political rule and political rulers. That's something they're seeking. I think, without thinking of Malikism, so not necessarily, I don't know, allegiance to the specific school is something that happens over time. I guess in general it becomes more and more stable and dominant.
Okay.
In the early period, it's more flexible. There's a variety of opportunities, of possibilities. And then by the 14th century, you have a more stable identification with a regional tradition, Malikism. And they're legit. I think what would we call how they legitimate themselves socially is contested. There's a really interesting interaction with Sufism and other, what do you want to call it, sources of religious charisma and authority. And they kind of become fused. But one of their biggest claims to social authority is kind of how I think about it, and prestige, is their literacy. Like they are literate. They're like the most.
Right.
They're of a one with the most literate practitioners of the sacred text, because it's what they work with. One of their.
Yeah, that makes a lot more sense.
Yeah.
I think I was just forgetting just how much. I get it now.
No, that's yeah. And it's a literacy and pre-modern literacy. I think it's hard to wrap one's head around.
Yeah.
And trying to account for how different it is to be in a place in which it's so much more reduced. And then, but I also think that if we illustrated it better, like understanding its power, why then in West Africa, like, which I'll mention, I think I mentioned it here, but the political history of West Africa is one in which these highly literate ulama play a key role, because it's this literate tradition that appears and is used as the foundation for several state building movements in West Africa. I would actually the History of Islam in Africa book, it's a little bit of a mess, but it's very good on that. This book on Trans-Saharan Trails by Ghislaine Lydon is a very good study of the 19th century commercial practices and families gathering documents. And this is on southern Algeria, where there's also these kinds of collections. So this is a still open, rich field to look into. There's these like kind of desert oases collections and family collections, and that some of them are very rich. Some are sectarian, like Ibadi in southern Algeria. And a really interesting thing there, in the long run too, is that some of these, you can keep. So like why it's not just Malikism is like you can participate in a commercial juristic discourse that is in trans-state and trans-cultural in the Sahara, while keeping your sectarian identity, but adopting and participating in let's say the more sophisticated like legal discourse too. So which is a super interesting problem, but something I wanted to.
At this point, I want to make sure to invite non-members of the class to ask their questions so that we can be sure to incorporate them. We can come back to class questions and other sort of broader remarks connecting with last week, maybe at 3:30. But for now, I wanted to give everybody else a chance to ask or to clarify or to go back. And then we can take a short break and get water or whatever.
I want you to draw just a little bit more agency of movement, but also the agents themselves. The agents themselves. I mean, I like the idea of the movement having agency, but I wanted to hear more why Ahmed Baba wants to do a tarjuma in Timbuktu. What's motivating him individually, and then maybe what the effects of that were in Timbuktu. Having done it. I mean, we may not have access. There may be no answer. I'm just curious if you do have speculations on what's motivating him.
What's motivating him specifically?
I get the story a little bit better, but I
because I was gonna like the easy answer would be just to tell you more about Khadija. But because he seems like to be well, I mean, is it the lack of state patronage that is the big question, or the
right?
I mean I think that's what's most interesting.
Why libraries of Maliki jurisprudence sitting in places that don't use them? In that way.
And so because there's not there's this problem. I do want to link like the kind of because I do think of Malikism as a one with the Umayyad, with the Spanish Umayyad Caliphate, and so I do think one of its persistence is that it's associated with one of the more important political traditions of the region, called this one would be an Islamic political tradition of the region, that then is kind of adopted further south and reformulated, and Malikism is associated with that. I think of that. So I do want to associate it with the state and state building moment. The Almoravids were kind of do that. The thing is, famously, right, as you would well know, when the Almoravids fall, they're conquered by this other Moroccan Berber movement that kind of targets them specifically, because you have a kind of an alternate. I read this as a political movement that has an alternate source of religious, spiritual, and social authority that targets the Malikis as like, no, you're all scholastic fuddy-duddies, get out of the way, we're coming in. And that's super interesting. And this, even though this movement is more successful builder of state and empire, they do not obliterate it at all. The Maliki tradition, it survives that and re-emerges, and this happens elsewhere before, so it does survive healthily outside, possibly because it has all these sources. Like it can survive in Cairo, so it can live and be cultivated as a non-state learning tradition in a place like Cairo. It's not enemy of the state or anything, but it doesn't need that state support. And a super interesting thing about the study of the 14 scholars that Ahmed Baba includes into the history of the Malikis is that they are, while you can kind of see them as coming from Morocco, that kind of an extension of Moroccan Malikism, their real intellectual debt is to Cairo and to a Cairo connection. So that one can be broke because it's broken sometimes politically. So they may take this other movement and these other areas which are not state funded, right, like Cairo, will feed them. I mean, in the bigger picture is that some things can, that movement and settlement can produce a new thing. So in the longer history of state building in West Africa, the movement of ulama into it builds states. And the Malikis are central to that, and Ahmed Baba is kind of central to that. And we kind of see a state trying to kidnap him and to build an empire by by claiming that Timbuktu is part of Morocco in a way, which is what Ahmed al-Mansour is trying to do, arguably. I know I haven't answered your question, but I've hit on of its ingredients. And I actually need to read more about Ahmed. The other thing is that he's writing in exile in a lot of it, so I think there's a lot to read into it. I don't know if there's like in a way, it's like there's a simple question about it's like about the prestige of his family and its status in Timbuktu, and I think that's part of it. It's a strategy for writing themselves into a regional history and his importance. And he had this sort of classic but difficult relationship with al-Mansur, with Moroccan power. He stayed independent of it. I don't know if it's just a trope because it reads a lot like the trope of the independence of legal scholarship from political power, which is almost always, or many, often described as corrupting and undesirable and a corrupting force on legal scholarship, which we didn't talk about, but it's a really important part of the culture of the culture of Islamic law as a network of the scholars of the authority that they claim this kind of independence from the Sultan or from central political power or military power. And like in teaching in class, I often focus on this because it's a kind of constitutional balance. It's a kind of independent judiciary, and you can think of it in a way that way. I don't know. That beyond that, right now, I'll think more.
So, do you, in a sense, saying that movement is a kind of evolution of Islam, or movement by itself is the evolution?
Yeah.
Because in these locations, there were some laws, and there were some cultures that operated before Islam.
Sure.
Even in Arabia.
Yeah.
What is there any influence from those
Sure.
cultures?
Yes. Absolutely. 1,000,000%.
So what are those? Because they're not Islamic.
Yeah.
Or I don't know about this West Africa, but I know about further east that there were perhaps very stable, deep culture of law and order.
Yeah. No, that's a great question. It's important, and I'm not sure I can give you smoking gun, but I certainly how I think about it. And when I was saying that movement is indispensable to the culture that we know, I was thinking of just like the way our languages form and the way our medieval literary works form. They're demonstrably kind of products of translation and movement and interaction, like they're kind of diglossic. Just like the English language, or as an example of that. I think law is very much even like the Arabic language itself, like is produced the script, right, and the language arguably in its interaction with the non-Arab speaker, right. So it needs to articulate itself in order for it to be understood and practiced by others. So that's kind of what I meant about like the culture. The examples of the culture are produced through its movement, and that's really key to understanding the articulation of classical Islamic culture in general. And that's why we showed the map first, because the point is that by 750 there is no classic Islamic law. Like I would posit it. It's an over-argument, but I kind of firmly believe in it. That it only really comes into shape in this ultra-wide variety of situations. Right, from Cairo to Timbuktu to Sijil Masa to Cordoba, you have practitioners of Islamic law and widely varying, like weak state, weak government, stronger, rural, desert, whatever, bunch of Christians living around us, or as minority, as relative majority, in all these wide varying situations, people developing a complex working legal system. So kind of there's a problem of like kind of by definition it has to include the practice that is there. The textual problem is that kind of how we were talking about how like the Arab tales of the conquest ignore the non-Muslim. Islamic law epistemologically kind of posits that the non-Islamic is of no incidence in its formation, and increasingly so. So the earliest legal authorities like Malik and Abu Hanifa are ones who they, you know, in Halak's kind of history of Islamic law, that chapter that you read, he posits that the early juristic authorities of Islam use their own individual authority as pious people, as people who had direct connection to either the Prophet or to companions of the Prophet, or who came from there and knew just by virtue of who they were. But that later generations kind of had to systematize it. And that systematization was highly textual at times, and it kind of like reinforced the authority of the Islamic text of the Hadith and as you know. And so there is and in the discourse there's like this notion of that its sources are only Islamic. So there's a tendency to only acknowledge the Muslim sources, but on the other hand, there's a long history of interaction of existing practices. We can like one part of this, one simple answer to this question is one form of practice, which posits that all customary practice is lawful unless it contradicts Sharia. And for something to really contradict Sharia, you can make it really, really a pretty high bar. Like it has to be kind of egregious. There are many ways to kind of accommodate things into that. And there is a long, I think, very long history and tradition of adoption of customary practice. And to add to this, there certainly is the case where customary practice becomes, especially regionally, associated with Islam, and it wasn't originally, which we also know of several incidences of that. So, because in a way, it's like rebuilding its not legitimacy, but its lawfulness. It's the epistemological source of its lawfulness as an activity. Like the highest thing is that if it's Islamic. So often, popularly, people are like, oh no, this is Muslim practice. But if you kind of put it under a microscope, you're like, what? There's no textual source. It's not like Quranic or something. So most likely it's customary, developed into. But this happens over a couple centuries, so it's certainly hard to trace.
Thank you. I was very interested by the idea of tracing or looking on different patterns of how the Maliki tradition is being established in different places. Yeah. And I guess that my question would be in your study, in your research about it, do you identify or do you think of like different patterns that are shaped by geography, for example? So like in the Sahara, for example, as opposed to Iberia or to the Mediterranean or the Eastern Mediterranean or I don't know, Southern Morocco. So how like the particular geography is connected to the way that kind of like Maliki traditions are being planted or established in like particular places. And then I guess that the same question can also be asked about like particular different forms of political or social organization. So like in like among the Berbers, would it be different? Do you see different patterns as kind of like the same sort of like the same sort of traditions are being introduced to the Umayyads in Spain?
Yeah, I think this because it works off the last question, and it's we could posit like a different model for thinking about it. Because I mean, for me, it's important that we should realize like the flexibility of this system. It's obviously not something that's rigid and can be imposed rigidly, because people would just say no, thank you. Like there's no authority to impose it as some kind of standard, Maliki imperial code. Like obviously it would not work and does not work that way. So it's you could think of there being like a core sense of allegiance to a intellectual tradition, a religious intellectual tradition, because it's a variety of people, teachers, and their authority, and then a kind of recurrent steps in how to deal with certain questions. But that being like just really an armature of allegiance. But then there's all these areas of activity that are really on the side and really local. So, for example, Mediterranean is one space and the Sahara is another space, where another reason they're super interesting is because they have customary law, like by so there's all these ships moving around the Mediterranean, and I avoided talking about this because as it was, this was way too much to try to talk about. But they have a law. They have this like recognized customary law that everybody has to deal with, and Islamic law in general just acknowledges it as this kind of urf, these words like amal and urf and adat are the three terms to like look into Islamic law. Ada, urf, and amal as like the ones associated with notions of practice and customary law and stuff. So the sea commerce has what customary practice that is acknowledged and therefore part of Maliki law, but really only regionally. Really, it's only there. It's not encoded into like the kind of the central armature, whatever you want to call it, part of the structure, because it's not. It's really local customary practice. And I think some kinds of Saharan commerce are likewise. So that's one answer. Another part is it does go a lot deeper, and because there is, let's say, between Ibn Rushd al-Jad, between 1100 and let's say Ash-Shatibi in Granada in the middle of the 15th century, there is actually quite a bit of sophistication and elaboration of the law in those centuries, and it becomes a more, a richer system, if anything. In one of the places you can see like this richness is locally, and there in those centuries you have a concept of local practice really crystallizing. So you have amal fez and amal tudela. There's actually a pretty good study. French last name with an S. I'll think of it in a second. And he traces a kind of this sources for this kind of regional practice. So there is certainly a notion of regional amal as a source of making decisions. As judges making binding decisions, they can use local practice for that, and we see that kind of developing roughly around the 14th century, more strongly in the Maghrib. So does that kind of answer your question? So I would think of it as like a central branch, and then like leaves that where you can see really like a local practice, but it just has to fit. I don't know what the fit is though. Does it have to be explicitly like legal theoretical, or can it just be on the authority of individuals? But
let's take a pause here, catch our breath, get any refreshments, we'll run to the restroom. Those who are in the class, come back. Anyone who wants to stay is welcome to stay for the continuing discussion for another 20 minutes or so, but you're free to go. So thank you, Camilo.
thank you for the question.
And we'll be back in a minute.